One of the questions I get asked the most is, how do I implement mobility training? And the simple answer is, it depends. Everyone is going to respond differently to mobility training and have different needs. So the ways of implementing mobility work is going to vary from person to person, and it depends on your training history, your injury and rehab history, if you are coming back from surgery or an injury, your joint health, the amount of time you have to dedicate to mobility training, so many factors. So I'm going to talk through an example of how I might implement this mobility work into a strength training session. It's not necessarily about which mobility exercises you choose or perform. It's really about the amount of effort or tension that you're using in these exercises. So I'm going to show you and talk you through effort levels of each of these movements that will help enhance your strength training work. So if we're starting with a blood flow warm-up, we want to get blood flow to the body and the tissues, and especially the joints that we'll be using in that workout, to let the body know that it's about to be time to work. We want to wake up the joints that we're using. So we're going to be using some joint-by-joint mobilizations or controlled articular rotation to get some blood flow into these tissues. So as we get into our blood flow warm-up, we're going to be using 40% of our max effort with these movements. So as I'm doing my toe cars here, I'm using 40% of my max effort, or about a 4 or 5 out of 10, in order to perform these movements. So I'm getting blood flow to the tissues, but I'm not necessarily overstressing them. We're just trying to, at this point, assess the joints. How are they feeling? How are they moving today? And telling those tissues that we are going to be using them and needing them. So we can do controlled articular rotations first thing in the morning. We can do them throughout the day. Before a workout, we're just using maybe a little bit more tension, around that 40%, to tell them that we are going to be, this is not just for movement's sake, it's to assess and see and get those tissues ready to push some weight. So in this strength training session, I'm just going through a few examples of controlled articular rotations and joint by joint mobilizations. In this strength training, we're going to be doing some goblet squats. That's going to be the main set. You can, of course, implement mobility work into your accessory work. It doesn't have to be for the main set, just for sake of time. So I'm not up here for a full hour. We're just going to be doing it with the main set. So now I'm going into knee cars. So I'm working through the rotation, flexion, and extension of my knees. We're going to need those knees for our squats. We're going to do goblet squats, a pretty common set and rep scheme. So we're going to do 3 sets of 8, and then we'll switch sides. So just working through, assessing these joints, going through these cars here, around 40% tension. I'm getting blood flow to the lower body, and specifically the joints of the lower body, to get those tissues ready to go. So then I'm going to stand up for my hip cars. The hips are the most important joint of that lower body as we go into our squats and deadlifts. So we're just going to make sure that those hips are moving nice and smooth. Again, just using about 40% of my max effort for these movements. Assessing the flexion, abduction, rotation of the hip, extension. And the blood flow should take about 5-10 minutes tops. And then we always switch sides. Notice how one side may be different than the other. Just going through these nice blood flow warm up. So now I'm going to move up to the hips and the spine. So I'm going to go through some cat-cows here. Getting that spine warmed up. I'm just showing you a few examples of what you might want for a squat day, or what I might use with some of my clients for a squat day. And some hip work here, hip and pelvis, checking in with the hips and that spine, that lower back. And then finishing up with some ankle work here as well. So doing this blood flow warm up like this really helps also learn about the joints that are involved in the movements that you'll be doing later. So we need the toes, the feet, the ankle, the knees, the hips, and the spine all involved in our goblet squats. So just going through those joints helps to figure out how that body's really feeling today. So again, with the blood flow warm up, we're working around 40% tension. Doesn't matter the exercise, just think that 40%, 4 or 5 out of 10 effort. Then we're gonna move on to our more specific movement prep, really prepping those joints to start moving in the pattern that they'll be moving in, not necessarily just in any pattern or a controlled articular rotation pattern, and adding some load and more tension to those movements. So I'm going to start with a dorsiflexion kinetic stretch. So I'm going to go half kneeling. And as I shift forward into this stretch, I'm going to try to lift my toes and the ball of the foot, trying to drive that knee forward. And then I'm going to push down to come back out. So I'm pulling into my end range with that dorsiflexion and pushing out. When we're priming or prepping, we are working in a 40 to 60% tension. So now I'm upping that tension to about 50. And each rep I do, I'm gonna inch it up a little bit more towards that 60%. So now with this last one, I'm gonna stay in that dorsiflexion or in that forward shifted position and focus on the knee. So I'm gonna lift and lower that heel. Again, driving down into that ground at about 60% tension with these ones. I'm also feeling a stretch in this back leg because I've got tension reaching back into that back foot. And if you notice, this is just basically one side of my squat. So I'm working the ankles and the knees in that position that I'm going to be loading with quite a bit of weight in just a minute. So then I switch sides. I'm going to do my kinetic stretching with that left ankle pulling into that stretch and then pushing out of it. I've got about 45% tension now. By the time I reach that last rep, I'm going to inch my way up to about 60% tension. Now, performing a few reps and increasing that effort with each rep also helps you learn how to isometrically load or how to internally load the body so that you don't even need external weights in order to work the body. So I'm going to hold this last one. I'm going to lift and lower that heel. I'm working at around 60% tension, driving into the floor. Just prepping the ankle and the knee tissues for those squats ahead. And I'm feeling a deep stretch in the front of that back hip as well. I also feel a deep hip bend on this side. So I'm feeling those glutes work here, which is going to be super helpful in getting myself out of the bottom of my squat. All right. So let's go into some hip specific work. We're going to need some abduction of the hips, some internal and external rotation of the hips. So this is all active hip work. Again, I'm working in that 40 to 60% range. So I'm going to go into this collapsed quadruped position as I lift up. I'm going to bend the knee. I'm just going to go in and out of that external rotation. This doesn't have to be super specific, right? I'm just working on getting those tissues rotating the leg from the hip. Increase that tension, driving into the floor more and more each rep. And so I'm not even using any external load for this movement prep. Of course, a lot of movement preps in lifting do use external loads, but for the purpose of showing you how we use mobility work to prep the tissues, I'm not even using any external load, but my tissues are still going to be ready to lift my working set as soon as I get into my squats. So I lift, bend the knee, and I'm just working into that rotation again of the hips. Increase that tension that I'm pressing down into the floor and trying to increase the tension in the hip by rotating further and further with each rep. I'm trying to get deeper into these ranges of motion. Using my breath here. The more tension and effort you use, the more you're also going to warm up the core, abdominals, and that spine. So that spine will be able to take load as well. We're going to do one more movement prep. This one is a Dumphy squat. So I'm really going to be working into that specific movement pattern that I'll be using in my goblet squat. So I'm going to use 50, 55, 60, maybe even into 65 so that by the time I get to my working set with the kettlebell, I don't need to do any warm-ups. So I'll start at about 45 here, driving up into the ceiling, getting my squat stance that I'm about to use, right? No use in warming up a different squat pattern. We're just going to use the squat that we're going to use in our goblet squat, pushing up, 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 up to let myself down. And then I'm going to push the feet into the floor to come up. Then I'm going to increase that tension to about 50%, pushing up, maintain that as we go down into the squat. And coming back up. Now we increase that to 55%. So I'm using the incremental increases to just see what my limits are and how much tension I really can produce in this movement pattern. Then we're going to increase to 60. Breathing to go down. That stick is going to help you get lower in that squat. And with a goblet squat, you're usually going for depth. And then 65. Keep the 65 coming up. I've done a general blood flow warm-up of the tissues at around 40% of my max. I've done my movement prep from 40 to 60% of my max. Now we're ready to get into our working sets. You can do your regular strength set and then add these supersets. These are all going to be supersets in this example. So you can add your supersets in for your accessory work. Just for today, we're just doing one set of strength work, which is our goblet squat. So I'm going to be doing 3 sets of 8, and I'm going to be showing with a 28 kilo. So very doable for 8 reps for me. And because of those dumpy squats that I just did, I'm already ready to do my goblet squats. I've got my tissues prepped and I've got the effort prepped. It felt as though I was doing those movements loaded. So now I can get right into my first working set. So I'm going to do a set of 8 squats. Again, with the goblet squat, kind of focusing on that depth. So I'm going to be going all the way down. All right, so I finished my set of 8. Now I'm going to superset that with some mobility work. So I can stress the same muscle group that is being worked in this in the goblet squat, which is a lot of quads. I'm going to work the same muscle group in our deep squat. We are flexed in the knees, and then I'm going to work. So now I'm going to work the quads in their extended, lengthened position. So we are decelerating that knee flexion with the quads on the way down. And now I'm going to work in knee extension. So the quads are now going to be working to keeping that leg straight. So I'm going to do some hip flexion hovers. So I'm just going to hover over my kettlebell. Obviously, this is scalable to your abilities. So I'm going to keep that knee straight. Again, the focus is the quads. So as I lift over with that leg, I'm working on keeping those quads nice and cramped. So yes, we are working the hip in that hip flexion, but like I said, we can always change the intention of these mobility movements. Right now I'm using that tension of that knee fully extended to really target the same muscle group being used in the squat, which is the quads, but now in their lengthened position instead of shortened. So a similar superset, if you were doing just strength work, would be like a leg extension machine. But you'll find out if by doing these hip flexion hovers that you don't even need that extra weight to really get the full effect of those quads. We're improving not only the mobility of the knees by strengthening these quads to keep that knee straight, but also the mobility of the hip in that flexed position. Okay, So then from there, I would rest before I would go into that again. So with the next set, I will show you a different way to superset mobility work into your strength training. It doesn't always have to be that same muscle group. It can be the opposing muscle group. It can be also working with the opposing muscle group in their lengthened or shortened phases. All right, so we're gonna get into another set of 8. All right. So what we can also do while supersetting our strength work is work in an area that is challenged in our strength set. So in our deep squat, our goblet squat, the knee internal rotation is often challenged. So when we're going into this deep squat, this is super, super common to collapse in on the ankles and allow the shins to externally rotate. But what we actually need to keep those feet flat on the floor and to keep those knees from caving in unpreparedly is to internally rotate from the knee and place that foot flat on the floor. So if we're really focusing on that internal rotation in our strength set, we can also focus on it in our superset mobility work. So we can go into some knee axial rotations, focusing on that internal rotation. So locking that knee into place, I can go into my external shin rotation and internal here. I'm really drilling that internal rotation, which is what we're looking for in that traditional goblet deep squat. So you can see that shin rotating from that knee as I'm going through this drill. And we can switch sides. So this is going to probably be working at around a 50% effort. The squats, I would say right now, are probably at around a 70%. So this is going to be significantly less. Something like the hip flexion hovers would probably be more closer to that 60, 70%. So you'd probably need more rest for that after those supersets. The tension that you can use, the amount of effort that you use with your mobility work when supersetting with a strength set is somewhere between that 50, 60% range all the way up to that 80%. So we can work really, really hard in those supersets. Just know that the higher that we get in that effort, the more rest before the next strength set. Just because mobility work is most of the time done without weight doesn't mean that the muscles, the tissues, and the joints and the central nervous system are not working hard. So we want to give adequate rest. Mobility work is, if we're working around that 40% range, can be considered an active rest, but most of the time is not actually rest. It is work. So we need to rest after that before we get into our next superset. So we're gonna go into one more strength set, and then I'm gonna show you one more way out of unlimited to implement mobility work into a superset with a strength set. So we'll go one more set of squats. So now with my next set, after doing that knee work, I'm focusing a lot on that knee rotation. And if I were to keep doing the hip flexion work, I would feel my quads a lot more on the descent. So we can also stress opposing muscle groups and also opposing parts of the body with our supersets. So in this superset, I'm going to move from the lower body strength set to an upper body mobility set. So I'm going to do a shoulder flexion hover. Very simple. I'm just going to lie face down and hover my arms over the yoga blocks. Set up my blocks outside of those arms. And now I'm stressing the upper body, giving the lower body a break. Now this superset, I'm going to be able to use more tension with that upper body, so I'm making it more difficult, using around 80%.
in order to lift and hover over. Since my lower body is resting, with the goblet squat, it is difficult to hold the weight, so the upper body is not fully rested getting into these, but we're still able to work at that high level. Just like with regular strength training work, we want to try not to move into sloppy movement. We're still keeping the integrity of these hovers. And because I'm working at a high level of intensity, I'm going to give myself plenty of rest after these sets.
So that's our strength set. I love to use supersets, strength and mobility work. I think it's a great way to reinforce good habits that you're trying to promote. I love using it with my clients, especially my clients that don't like resting. They feel like they're doing something while they rest. So you could take maybe a little shorter rest afterwards, depending on the load that you're using and the mobility work that you're doing. So like I said, with the strength training supersets, we're working around 50 to 80, 90%, depending on how much you're lifting and what the rest is if you are doing your main set versus your accessory work. So once we've done our lifting, then we can incorporate some mobility work into the cool down or the recovery. So we can just get into active stretches. So I love using mobility work, active stretches to finish out a workout. I'm just getting into a pigeon here, so I just reinforce that hip movement in the front hip and get a nice little stretch in that back hip. Since we were working into some deep hip flexion, we're gonna basically oppose that. In this pigeon stretch, I'm gonna try to lengthen the floor between my two legs and feet, and then I'm gonna shorten the floor. So I'm just working some isometrics here, pulling the floor and the legs apart, splitting the hips, and then shortening. You could also do some kinetic stretching here as well by pulling into the position and pushing out of it. Active stretching, using kinetic stretching and isometrics. And here we are working at around 30% tension. So we're working even with less tension than what we started. Nice and easy. This active stretching allows you to work into deeper ranges of motion than you needed for your strength training. So I try not to go into too deep ranges of motion, especially if you're hypermobile or if we don't need a deep range of motion for the strength training sets. I try to keep the ranges of motion within a working range. And then afterwards, we can get into deeper ranges of motion with a little lighter tension just to reinforce the work that we did in those joints and to get those joints moving a little bit deeper if we didn't really need that for the strength work. A lot of times I also like to do some spine training or core work with the recovery. So we could do a reverse crunch where we're just holding onto this kettlebell, legs are up in the air, and I'm working on very slowly sequencing the spine into flexion. Working on control here, of course. All the way down to the tailbone. So it's a really great opportunity to work with some spine, aka core work at the end of your training. This is just one example of how we can implement mobility training into a strength training session. We can also, of course, do an entire workout dedicated to mobility work. We can do active recovery days using mobility work and principles of mobility training. There are ways of training mobility as an everyday habit, and all of these I can address in future videos. This is just one example of how I specifically train myself and my clients through mobility work in the same session with strength training. There are endless ways of doing this, and not every way works for everybody. If you have any comments, drop them in the comments below, and I will see you next time.